Thank you, Charlie, for being on the podcast with us. I'm just gonna dive right into it. And who are you?
Hi, I'm Charlie, and I don't know what to call myself these days. I do security stuff and break and defend and do whatever. Yeah, do a lot of interesting work.
Yeah, so you're rather well known in sort of my circuit, and especially in Iceland, obviously wider as well. But you used to be a founder, and you worked for Syndis for a few years. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so at Syndis, well, originally when I moved to Iceland, I went to work for CCP. I was there for like 4 years, and then around that time when I left, there was this group of people in Iceland, you know, the Teddy and all these people that were starting a little consulting company. And I started getting in touch with them, and they were like, hey, do you want to come and join us? So this was like 3 months in after sort of the official launch of Syndis. I went and joined them. So I wasn't a founder of Syndis, but joined as a partner. I think I was hire number 2. There was Björn first, and then me shortly after. Yeah,
Wait,
so we...
What year? What year was this?
2014.
2014. Okay, but did you... Okay, so you were working for CCP before that or prior to that?
Yes.
Were you doing security stuff for CCP?
Yes, I was.
Can you maybe just a little bit tell me about what kind of security? Because I'm thinking about like in terms of gaming versus was it like...
All of it.
All of it? Okay.
Basically. Yeah, the security team was 2 people. Me and my boss. I did most of the technical work. So there was everything from game security, IT, like internal, external, corporate, the actual game servers, you know, all the vulnerability scanning, IDS, IPS management, because we also have to do with PCI, dealing with botting, cheating in the game, money laundering, real money trading, does a lot with organized crime, nation states. I caused a diplomatic incident with Russia once. It was a wild ride. Like the gaming industry is like a crazy world.
Okay, that's very interesting because in pen testing, burnout is quite common, right? But I imagine if you mix the two, maybe you have a really fast burn rate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you also were instrumental in founding Adversary, which was a sort of like a venture out of all of this. Can you tell me just a little bit about that?
Yeah, Adversary is interesting because it technically, the first traces of Adversary, obviously there's Emil Vigfusson, who did a lot of great work at Reykjavik University. I think maybe that's some of the original kind of steps, but for me, the story starts even before I joined Syndis, when we did work with Vodafone after the big incident back in 2013. And their question was, how to prevent this breach from happening again or something similar? The answer is training. Bunch of things happened, and Teddy asked me, hey, so we need to create this training for Vodafone. You're the new guy. Can you do this? And after a little bit of thinking, and also just somebody who dropped out of high school and has a very difficult relationship with education and how I learned personally, I was like, yes, but I want to do it in a way that I would want to learn it, which is hands-on.
Okay.
So that's when, I created this little basically demo over a couple of weekends, went and did that with Vodafone for like a small group of people. And they're like, hey, this is really fun. I think I did like 5-6 challenges of the OWASP Top 3, and they're like, hey, when do we do the rest of the OWASP Top 10? And then that just grew from there. We got funding from the government, eventually got some angel funding, and spun out eventually. So
okay.
That was 2014 already that started, until we sold in 2020.
So do you think that training is still the answer to the question of how do we prevent this?
That's a really challenging question, actually, because things are changing so rapidly. But I think this is maybe true for all aspects of security. I still think that for you to be able to build things really well, you also need to be able to break them.
Okay. Interesting. I'm gonna go into that in maybe a little bit later, but I have some more challenging questions, I hope. But okay, so you exit Adversary and eventually you find your way with your current employment. And I'm gonna sort of go into this malware research. So is that correct assumption? So you identify as a malware researcher, or that's what you're doing?
Yeah. So my official title that I'm spending my most time on is security researcher, but that is focused on malware at Aikido Security out of Ghent in Belgium. So what I primarily do is basically supply chain research, right? So what I'm doing on a daily basis is we have a pipeline. We're monitoring all of the NPM pipe, VS Code extensions, Rust, Cargo, NuGet, all of these ecosystems. And we're analyzing all of the new package versions that come out, all the new packages, and seeing if they look malicious. And then the output from that, I analyze together with one other guy that just started. And well, we've been quite busy this year because it turns out a lot of stuff has been happening. So that's my main role right now that I'm focusing on.
Okay. Is the typical process then something like you're monitoring all of these packages, if you will, within different ecosystems, then you have to manually analyze it and then, I guess, automate some of the detection or all of it even?
No, most of it is completely automated. So I think right now, last count I saw, we're analyzing 50,000 packages a day at least. And this was months ago before we had a lot of ecosystems. Most of that gets filtered through, right, a lot of it will not have a lot of indications of maliciousness. A lot of it will be, well, what gets flagged is either because of the rules that we have that flags it or because of LLM saying, hey, this needs to be looked at more. So in reality, we are triaging hundreds of packages a day. And when we do analyze them, right, we already have a analysis of, hey, what was it that actually indicated that this could be malicious? Of course, sometimes we're only seeing the secondary kind of signs and we didn't maybe catch the main thing. So we also need to then go and augment our rules that we have and patterns that we look for to make sure that we find the most malicious patterns consistently.
Yeah, okay. How is this different from, well, I guess, ethical hacking and just in general vulnerability research?
Yeah, so how it's different is that what we are looking at, well, what I'm doing in reality is much more sort of malware analysis. Only it's not binaries I look at. I'm just looking at code. One of the things that I really did a lot of at Syndis and was really one of my specialties was sort of white box testing, source code, review. And it's very similar to that, right? I'm looking at code all day and seeing, hey, what is this doing? And what it really overlaps with in terms of vulnerability research or penetration testing for me is that it's all driven by this curiosity given a system or a component to understand, how does this work?
So I also think that that's interesting in terms of, pen testing as a practice is usually a service for a particular customer, right? But it sounds like the malware research, especially the one that you're doing, is more sort of on the building blocks of software or systems that are already in place for many of these customers, meaning kind of like you're doing work on the far left side or the earlier stages of any kind of a compromise, which I think is quite interesting. And it's not really talked about that much here. Meanwhile, we know about a few incidents. You have this idea of the supply chain and all of that, and you have companies that are producing code at various I guess velocity, but then you have the developers often with quite a lot of technical power, if you will, and the oversight is not a lot, right? How do you actually monitor this as a company leader? How do you enable somebody like you or something like Aikido to actually get into the stack without having the buy-in from the developers who, as you know, always know best?
That's a challenging question, right? Because what we see, at least at Aikido, right? We are selling especially medium businesses, right, and also some enterprise. And there, acquiring the product is usually a developer-led process. From what I see, a lot of it, it's a lot of self-service, sort of product-led growth. So there, I think what we're seeing is that it is actually the developers that often are asking for this, because I think if you start to try to scale this out in large companies where it's a top-down thing, it usually just comes as a part of whatever sort of SaaS, DaaS, whatever security thing you want to, buy. It's usually just a part of that offering, because to do this yourself is really challenging and expensive. Like, it's just not something you want to do. So I think it's a case of people are just becoming more and more aware of they need to actually be mindful of this, because the developers are more and more the target of these attacks. They're not necessarily always trying to get into the production build of a system. They're just trying to get the credentials from a developer machine.
Yeah,
so,
and they would be considered high-value targets most of the time, right? Because, it's an easy way into production systems.
Yeah.
I kind of think that this shift left culture, if you should call it a culture, methodology, I guess, is really interesting, because I think it means like you want the developers or developer-led adoption of this kind of tooling. But I think they sometimes miss their mark if you don't have the sufficient buy-in from the top, at least a vocabulary that you can present to the top. Like, why is this important? Why should we do this? And as you say, doing it on our own is kind of hard unless you're a really big company, really well structured. The skills that you need are not easy to develop. But I wonder, I mean, does that mean, like, is it a culture thing, or is it like a technical thing? Is it a knowledge-based thing? Just getting to that stage?
For malware, right, I think there's also a really big argument to be made for this is not a problem that should be as much on the individual companies as it should be on the ecosystem itself, right? This is all about trust. And frankly, we're at a point where trust is really valuable, and it's something that is hard earned, and it's so easy to lose. And once you start to have that, you start to get fragmentation and a polarized ecosystem and world. So I think that's a very separate challenge. But in terms of like internal buy-in, I think what we're really seeing also for similar reasons, right, is that as we become so dependent and very reliant on how the tools we have today allow us to do things quickly, quickly, because that has been the case, but also with a lot more risk, this is something we'll have to really be mindful of, right? I think now is a point where, and I know this has been said for many years, but as a discipline, right? If you look at the bridges that are built every day, there's a reason why it's engineers with years of training that are building them. It's not because building a bridge that kind of works is difficult. It's because building a bridge that doesn't collapse and kill people is extremely challenging, right? That is what takes so much time to make sure people don't die. And the same will be true for computers now. And it is. People are dying because of things like ransomware attacks. That is a fact.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fact. But I think it's an interesting point you raise here about the engineers. But I've always looked at software development kind of more like a gardening or art rather than an engineering sort of field. And an argument can be made that it should be more sort of like theoretical or rather more sort of mathematical in nature. But that's not really the sentiment. It's artistic people. It's about the user experience and the flow of how you get value to the customer. It's not so much about how well architected it is, how resilient it is to attacks. And we often say there are an infinite amount of exploits in a code base. They just haven't all been found, right?
Yeah.
But what's your take on that gardening thing?
I think engineering like software and stuff like that is a really complex thing, because for you to do it well, there are so many things you need to know. And you need to continue to learn because things move really fast. And also what you're building is a moving target, right? You can go like one day, somebody will come and say, hey, we need to do this right now. And you just need to make it work for you to ship it. And that is the measure of success. Can we ship a feature and not have our superiors breathing down our neck? That often means, as I saw a lot at Cinders, that means by the time that the deadline is, very often the product is barely working, leave alone has been tested for a lot of the non-functional requirements that a C-level or a product manager is going to specify for you. A lot of the non-functional requirements are things you figure out in real time. And when you barely have a product working, so the happy flow through it is consistently okay, well, that's only like 20% of the work. That gives you 80% of the value, sure. But that last 20% of the value is the stuff that's going to bite you in the ass.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. But, I also am running a company now that's doing development. And, I think that there's a case to be made for going a balanced route on this. So not giving discount on security, but at the same time, we're still competing with large players that, may not always play by the same rules I want to play by. And, in this kind of competitive atmosphere where I guess oversight is lacking, this is going to be our reality for, some years to come, I think.
I saw an article today. There was an interview with a C-level person. I think it was a SolarWinds CISO, who basically had a sob story about how much weight he lost and how hard his life was after the big incident. And it's like, well, history will judge you for your decisions that you make. That's the reality of it. And if you decide to cut corners and have SolarWinds 123 as the password for one of your most sensitive systems, I'm sorry, you made the wrong choice. And you will suffer from it.
I think Mikko said this in a talk I attended. He said something like the company may survive, but the people that were part of sort of like the incident, they may not. Not necessarily that they're dying, but they may not sort of survive that incident, either being let go or just not wanting to continue after these kind of things. And I find that really interesting because so many regulatory frameworks are written sort of in blood, meaning, they're written as an afterthought after something bad has happened, especially when people have known about the risk for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really serious thing.
Yeah. Could I mention one quick thing here that to me is really important, right? Yeah. Because I recognize what you say, and I love, that saying of regulation being written in blood. There's, of course, the risk of regulatory capture. I think some of the European things around sort of development practice and stuff that has been discussed and is coming closer and closer can have a really negative impact, right? It will really stifle innovation. But at the same time, there's also regulation that is coming down. And I hate to be a Danish person right now because like a lot of the safety and monitoring and privacy regulation coming out of Denmark is frankly antithetical to everything that we do. And so to the extent that I think regulation is important, I also see that it can really create some very awful situations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally on your side on this. And I didn't mean to say anything like, we need more regulatory frameworks, but, absolutely not. But I was just thinking about just accidents in general, not necessarily, cybersecurity, but also, having gone through GDPR and all of those sort of frameworks. I mean, again, there's a case to be made that there are hugely valuable things in there, but at the same time, it does it can slow you down quite a bit. And it can also be for the sort of wrong reasons. This conversation is mostly sort of focused around the security aspect and the risk aspect, right? Not necessarily anything else. But I have actually sort of like a final question on this particular topic, which is that, what can business leaders actually do? And previously you mentioned training, but like, is there anything that they can do that's not just, the typical awareness training that you see all over the place?
Yeah. So in terms of training, I mean, I think training is important. I think real-time feedback is important because now the reality is we're going to be moving so fast. There's no stopping this AI train. So catching things as quickly as possible and having guardrails in place is probably the most important. We're literally flying by the edge of the seat at this point. So yeah, training, but in reality, that's not the solution either. I think it's, as much as I would love to say everybody should be trained really well and have done all of the training that is out there. Yeah, no, it's not realistic.
But with AI, so it's gonna maybe sound a little bit weird, but on almost every sort of big cybersecurity talk I listen to, there's always this inkling of somebody trying to sell you a product or a service or a technology, because that's how we get in front of the bad hackers, right? That's how we will win. This concept of winning versus losing in this race just seems really alien to me. It's an unfair game. The hacker has to find one thing, the defender has to kind of like know everything. It's impossible.
I think it's not a question of if something will happen, it's when, and how do you minimize damage, right? That's always the case. How do you respond as quickly as possible and contain it? Yeah, there's no winning. There is no reality, right? I think that's the unfortunate truth of whether you want to call it warfare or whatever, right? There's always going to be a push and a pull in any dynamic that is what drives growth. So I think what we have to do is just be as honest with ourselves as possible about how are we doing and make sure that we are doing what is right by individuals and society. And that should be the North Star for people in general, right? How do we minimize suffering?
Yeah, okay. But on to sort of like the business decisions that you would have to make around that. So first, I would say, is just getting around the fact that it's going to be an ongoing thing. It's going to be a continuous thing. It's going to be one line in your P&L, and you just have to allocate some funds to that sort of project and understand that it's never going to be over. And you're also going to have to sort of reinvest exactly the same way that you do with innovation. So there's your horizon. Your first horizon is to get to a certain stage. You have your vulnerability scanning and whatever you do, and then there's a second phase to that. But there's not really any kind of like a terminal state, whether it's cybersecurity or if it's in innovation, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I wanted to go a little bit into supply chain in general, and I mentioned this before we had this talk at one of our first guests here, Niels. He was talking about supply chain, and he's a hacker, he's an ethical hacker, and he hears people in the society or in all over the place, they're talking about supply chain, and that means very different things to different people. It can mean that your vendor applies some kind of like a security framework and all of those things, which is fine. But he likes his code, and he was thinking, in his world, the supply chain and the sort of first stages of it are the tools that are running on everybody's computer that have a GitHub repository maintained by maybe just an individual somewhere. So these people that he showed up on the screen were just like this person that made this tool that's part of almost every operating system all over the place. It's an open source thing. There's no oversight, all of that stuff. So just realizing that there's so many people in every person's supply chain was kind of an interesting thing here. And when I mentioned this to you, you wanted to talk about trust washing in terms of open source. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So this is a concept that I saw a friend in a close Slack group mention that I thought was really interesting from a compliance perspective, right? Any code that you write in-house, right? There's a lot of things that you have to do. There's kind of requirements, best practices that different compliance frameworks will specify how you should be doing things. The reality is that the foundations of basically everything we build is somebody else's code. In the case of sort of JavaScript, NPM as the big example, just by the numbers, right? the amount of dependencies that any application has, right? So basically the whole internet in terms of like web pages and things like that, those get incredibly complex, right? Those are big trees of dependencies. And when you have a auditor of some sort come in and look at how you do software development, right? They will look at all your internal practices, and then there's nothing they can say about open source components because they have no ability to look into what does this random person do in terms of how do they protect the NPM account, how do they protect the GitHub repo and stuff like that. So effectively, right, when there are carve-outs for open source components in any kind of compliance, regulatory kind of thing, right, that effectively becomes a trust washing mechanism where you say, don't pay attention to all of the code over here because that is a can of worm we're not able to open, right? Because frankly, that will ruin the idea of safety that we have because, well, it's just unfathomable to even reconsider how we are building software now. So what effectively you have is if you just open source software, you can kind of just wash it, right, in terms of trust. Or that is what is happening by default. And we are seeing that might not work so well anymore, certainly not without an ecosystem today is protecting itself.
Okay, but the ecosystem, so if we think about NPM, which are the JavaScript package manager, at least the most widely used, is it common practice for these ecosystems to actually apply any kind of like oversight or security? Or is that like a political kind of thing, whether or not the security of its content is on the ecosystem itself or if it's on the consumer?
I think a lot of these ecosystems like NPM has become the victim of their own success. And I think you will see this also from a recent letter that sort of there's this open software security something foundation, OpenSSF, and a bunch of the big companies in there put out an open letter saying, hey guys, like we are offering basically a free service and it's really expensive and we're not making any revenue from it. So, and you're expecting all of these things from us that are frankly unrealistic at the scale that we operate on, right? We are basically a free CDN that we're not generating revenue from. And with the volume that they are processing, frankly, yeah, I see that it's really difficult to expect for them to moderate things or take a very active role in it because that means that they are curating also. And that could have implications in terms of liability and things like that. But the reality is that means that it is on the community and the larger ecosystem to self-police or sort of keep itself safe. And with how quickly and how ubiquitous and ingrained it is now in every single part of society, I am not sure what the right decision here is. Like, I feel like there has to be some better middle ground if we are to move at this pace that we are now. Right? Trust does not move by the second. Trust moves by days and weeks.
I completely agree, but I just wonder, for example, with the advent of where AI is today, is that something that's going to be sort of in just maybe the next few years, is it going to be advantageous on that part, being like regulatory or helping us spot the bugs, or is it going to be more detrimental because it's allowing, teams to move quite fast and often right into a ditch, if you will?
I think the winners of this whole situation will be whoever finds the right balance and a set of trade-offs in terms of moving fast and moving in a safe way. I think on average, we're going to be driving into a ditch. It's just a question of how big is that ditch? And it just opens up a new set of challenges and concerns, right? It's a new set of challenges that nobody is really prepared for. We're going for it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a collective learning experience. And I saw some posting on Twitter yesterday about how AI code is making its way into the Linux stable kernel. And some of that stuff is scary.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. We can't stop it. I mean, and even as somebody that I would consider myself an early adopter of these technologies, maybe not, bullish, but still, the sort of world is still going far faster than I would like on this. It's hard to keep up. You have all of these, what are they called? The mistakes that are making, like hallucinations. You don't really, like you said, because trust takes time to build, and the trust for the output, especially like in terms of the LLMs, less so of course for the static models, but it takes time. And also it's not a given. You can't build a product or a business on ChatGPT. You need something like way deeper. You need your own tech stack, your set of processes to actually make it work, right? But it's going to be interesting either way, because there's nothing we can do to stop it. And if we're not part of it, then we're just going to be left behind, I think.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what it comes down to, right, whether you're talking on more individual level, right, when you check in some or make a pull request with some code, or more on a larger scale when a product comes out that has a lot of LLM slop, who's ultimately accountable, and at what level do you start to hold people accountable, right? And I think more and more, it's so tempting to try to feel like you're productive and checking in a lot of code that looks good, but you maybe haven't really tested it because you just want to move fast because you can now. But it's also difficult to hold yourself accountable, right? And say, hey, maybe I should slow down and really take the time, right? Good things take time. And in a world where instant gratification is such a big thing, that's something we have to really deal with, because we're so used to this high stimulation world, and we really need to slow down.
Yeah, all right. I think that's pretty good advice. I wanted to also maybe go into something a little bit more recent about what you've been doing. So you mentioned, for example, previously some worms or some incidents. Is there one top of mind that you would want to go into? Maybe the Shai-Hulud thing or something?
Yeah, so I actually think it's the whole month of September, more or less, right? We had 3 big incidents. We had the NX, so the package manager, have all the packages compromised with Singularity. Then we had the phishing attack against Quix, Josh is his name, that compromised the biggest packages on NPM, which is debug and chalk, by Wiz's numbers that could have infected about 99% of their cloud environments. Did infect about 10%.
Wiz being...
And then we had Wiz being a security company that's being acquired by Google.
Yeah, so impact-wise, it's going to be pretty big.
Yeah. And then we had Shai-Hulud, which was the follow-up attack to Singularity. And I think this was a wake-up call for the industry, right? How easy it was in a matter of minutes and hours for a significant amount of systems to be infected by this. In the case of the by the numbers kind of biggest breach, which was with the debug and chalk thing, we were really lucky. The attackers were dumb. They just tried to steal crypto. We weren't so lucky with Shai-Hulud, especially when they started to add the worming feature. We were really lucky that it didn't spread faster than it did. If you had the debug chalk incident using the payload from Shai-Hulud, I don't even want to speculate about what would have happened. That would have been potentially catastrophic. But we've gotten too lucky so far, in my opinion, and that's why we're seeing NPM making changes now. We're starting to see a lot of that stuff flow into other ecosystems, like the Visual Studio Code extension ecosystem. Again, seeing worming behavior automatically spreading. And as we start to move further up the stack in terms of the tools that people are using, right, other parts of the ecosystem and the supply chain, there's a lot of things that we did not account for in our threat models, right? We kind of assume that developers were these like really conscious people who, they're careful and things like that, but things happen. And from my perspective as somebody who writes code, I realize I am a ginormous liability, and I should act as such, right? I should minimize the potential blast radius if I make a mistake, or if something happens that without my ability to control it or influence it ends up causing harm.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of developers, because they're typically, technical, they try to play it safe, they try to take care of it, but as you say, things happen. But I see, for example, in a lot of these cases where you're supplying some kind of like an agent to monitor the computer in a certain way, the developers, sometimes they're excluded from that because they're so technical, right? Or because they've decided to run some particular distribution of Linux, which is hard to create the agent for, something like that. So, I mean, it's quite typical, but at the same time, those people for a hacker are going to be really good targets. You know, you can imagine a scenario where they're not under the same amount of scrutiny as some typical office worker that doesn't know computers. But the blast radius is going to be very different if you're successful. So I think that's really, really kind of interesting.
I think that I've certainly seen this a lot in my career, right? The more senior you are, I'm going to admit it myself, right? Sometimes we have to get off our high horses and realize we have just fucking human beings and not be so arrogant.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point. We don't know what the other people know about us or what they can do. What does the future of security look like then to you? What are the next 5 years going to look like?
Yeah, so I hear a question like this kind of a lot lately from people asking about advice around career changes, education, and stuff like that. And from my perspective, I think the answer realistically is, and if other people have more of a well-defined question, I'm not sure if I believe them. And it is that, frankly, we have no clue what the world looks like in 5 years, certainly within IT and security, because things are changing at such a rapid pace that it's, I mean, just looking back to the start of the year where we are now, I don't know that I could have predicted it. I don't know that I can predict what happens in a year from now, right? Certainly any suggestion, like when people ask me, should I go into security? I go, yeah, but I don't know what security is going to look like in 4 years. Like, I don't know if my job exists in 2 years, legitimately. The only thing I know is that I make sure that I am as agile and as adaptable as possible, such that I don't become a dinosaur.
I think that's a really well put. And I would like to add to this that, you know, firstly, cybersecurity as an umbrella concept is quite huge. It encompasses, you know, the compliance, the technical security, the IT security, and you know that, you know, IT and cybersecurity from a pen testing point of view, they don't necessarily mix that well because they have different objectives. You know, IT in general is about providing value, keeping the lights on, while the pen tester is trying to find everything that's wrong with it, and so on and so forth. Obviously, just in my few years in this industry, things have changed also quite a bit. And sometimes I wonder, and that's a question for you, is if cybersecurity as an industry, as a sort of a concept, is it just like a bubble? Is it going to burst? Because you mentioned this. So people are asking, should I go into cybersecurity? I mean, that's not a well-defined question. It could be like a number of things.
Yeah.
But what is it going to be? Is, for example, the concept too much of an umbrella concept just to kind of wrap your head around?
I don't think so. And I think if we really take a step back and zoom out, I think that cybersecurity is a very safe field to get into, and it's for all the wrong reasons, right? I think the reason why it is important to go into security right now is that whether we like it or not, it is one of the frontiers of especially hybrid warfare now, where frankly we used to think that we were protected by borders, and the reality we're seeing is that not only are we not protected by borders, but every single company is a border of its own that is subject to sabotage and attack by nation state in these campaigns. And it's a grim way of looking at the world, but that is what is going on. And that means we have a lot of borders to protect.
Yeah, and probably some micro borders within those sort of company borders as well, I would imagine. Yes. But, you know, again, going into the cybersecurity industry or field, to obviously focused on mostly the defensive. The nation states may have some offensive capabilities and people, you know, working legitimate jobs on the offensive side, of course. But I'm not speculating, but I'm hoping that the sort of the research and essentially the amount of funding that's going into cybersecurity as a whole will actually produce something really very interesting that's not really in the space of cybersecurity. Do you understand where I'm going with this? That the investment will create some kind of innovation based on everything that's happening in cybersecurity, and maybe one day we'll see something, I don't know, something cool, like a cybersecurity penicillin or something like that.
Yeah, I think in that case, the target just shifts, right? Once you have that, the threat model changes.
Probably.
I mean, certainly again, I'm a high school dropout. I would probably not go into like a 3 to 5 year education at this point. What I would do is be certain that I'm a quick learner and love learning. And then also on the point of offensive, defensive, again, my background colors this viewpoint a lot. I still think offense is the best defense in many ways. And it is an arms race in terms of certainly vulnerability research. It's a question of who finds the vulnerabilities first.
Okay, I think that's a really fair point. I don't really have a follow-up for it, but maybe that should just be the sort of final nail in that conversation. Offensive, where offense is the best defense.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was a really fun conversation. It's really interesting. Now I want to go into the offensive.
Yeah.
I really thank you for this chat.
So welcome.
We'll be in touch.
Yes.